Hello everybody. In this video we are going to take a look at nonlinear deformers in Maya. And to get started I am going to create 3 cylinders. I will make all 3 cylinders 24 units high. Here's my second cylinder. This cylinder, however, I'm also going to add 24 subdivisions on the height. And then I think I'll just duplicate this cylinder, and I'm going to rotate this one 90 degrees and freeze the transforms on it. And one other thing I'll do so that you can see what's happening a little better is go to Shading, Wireframe, Unshaded. That way you can see the cylinder's geometry. Okay, we'll take the first cylinder, and then what I'm going to do is go to the Deform menu and find Nonlinear. The first nonlinear deformer we'll take a look at will be the bend deformer. So I will apply that on the cylinder that I currently have selected, or had selected. And what I will do is I will come over here to the channel box, under the inputs, bend 1, curvature. I'm going to select the word curvature and I'm going to middle mouse drag in my viewport, and this is what I get. This is not the desired behavior that I want. So let's try applying another bend deformer but on this cylinder. Once again I will go to Deform, Nonlinear, Bend, come over here to the channel box, under the inputs, Bend, select Curvature, and I will middle mouse drag, and this is much better. So what is the difference between this cylinder and this cylinder? Well, if you remember, I added subdivisions on the height. For these deformers to work, I need to have enough geometry. This cylinder simply doesn't have the geometry along its length to be able to bend, while this one does. Let's take a look at a couple more things that we can do with this bend deformer. So I still have my bend deformer selected. Under inputs, I can change the curvature. In fact, I can make it come all the way around full circle here. And I can also adjust these 2 parameters, the low bound and high bound. If I select the low bound and adjust those values, you see that that'll affect the lower part of the bend. And if I select the high bound, it'll select the top part of the bend. I'm going to decrease the bend here so that I can show you a couple other things that we can do with this bend deformer. So what happens if I select the geometry itself and move it off of the deformer? Or if I select the deformer itself and move it off of the geometry. Rotating the deformer. And finally, let's take a look at this third cylinder. I will apply a bend deformer to it as well. Remember that I froze the transforms on it. Select the cylinder, go to Deform, Nonlinear, Bend. Notice the orientation of my deformer, and if I apply the curvature property to it, this is what I get. This, of course, might not be the actual desired effect, in which case I can take the deformer itself and simply rotate it in the orientation that I want the bend to be in. We can use these nonlinear deformers as modeling tools. One thing I should mention, however, is that when you're done using the deformer as a modeling tool, you should delete the history. Remember that if I grab the mesh and move it, it's still being affected by that deformer. Or if I move the deformer itself, it's also going to affect the mesh. So what I can do is select my geometry. Remember that you have your history here under the inputs. In this case, we've got the bend 3 as part of the history of this piece of geometry. With our geometry selected, I will go to Edit, Delete by Type, History. This eliminates that history, and now I can move my mesh without any difficulty. One other thing that I should mention about these nonlinear deformers is that we can also apply them to component selections. I'm going to select the vertices in this, this arm-like form here, and I will go to Deform, Nonlinear Bend. I'm going to rotate the deformer 90 degrees, and I will put a curve on it. Perhaps I will also decrease the low bound and maybe adjust the placement of my bend deformer. Now that we've taken a look at the bend deformer, let's take a look at a few more nonlinear deformers. The next deformer we'll take a look at is Flare. I have my cylinder selected. Notice that it has plenty of geometry to be able to apply these deformers. I will go to Deform, Nonlinear, Flare, and we'll take a look at some of its properties. Notice that we have Start Flare X, Start Flare Z. Let's try adjusting those parameters and see what happens. So with Start Flare X selected, you can see that it flares it out on that single axis. Start Flare Z will flare it out on the other axis. If I select both the End Flare X and End Flare Z properties, I can adjust them both at the same time. And there is also this curve property, which will adjust the middle. And like the bend deformer, we've got our low bound and our high bound. And just like the bend deformer, we can move the deformer off of the geometry itself as well. Remember that I said when you use these nonlinear deformers as modeling tools, you should, when you're done with them, select the mesh and delete the history. But what if you decide that you actually don't want to keep the effect that the deformer has on it? Let's say that you've changed your mind. Well, what we can do is we can select the deformer itself. Here it is, Flare 1 handle. I can also select it in my viewport and delete it. And the deformer will no longer have the effect on the geometry. Let's take a look at another deformer, the Sine deformer. I'll select my cylinder, go to Deform, Nonlinear Sine. If we look at the in the viewport in the wireframe, you'll see that the deformer itself is going down the length of my cylinder here. And once again, we have a number of different properties here that we can work with. The first one we'll take a look at is amplitude. And if I increase the amplitude, this is what we get. I can also adjust the wavelength. It's set to 2 right now, but if I make it greater, the wavelength becomes larger. If I make the, or we get less waves, I should say. And decreasing it, we'll get more. Here's where you can really see that in this case, we would probably need to have more subdivisions on the height segment to get this form to deform smoothly. I'm going to bring the amplitude down, and I'll increase the wavelength to get something like this. Let's take a look at yet another channel or property of the sine wave nonlinear deformer, the offset. I will select the word here. Remember that you can actually type in the values manually as well. However, I always find that the more intuitive way is to simply select the word and middle mouse drag. And I can adjust the offset of my sine wave. Now this brings up an interesting point, because what I've said up to this point is if you're using it as a modeling tool, then when you're done with it, you should select the mesh and delete the history. But on rare occasions, you want to have the history. And what I'd like to point out here is that we can also use these nonlinear deformers as animation tools. And when we use them as animation tools, we want to keep that history. Let's take a look at how we can use this nonlinear deformer to animate this cylinder. In my timeline, I'm going to I will drag the timeline to frame 24. And because I'm animating at 24 frames a second, that means that nothing will happen until 1 second into my clip. I'm going to set a key on the offset by right-clicking on it and saying key selected. Notice that we have a little red mark here, as well as here in my timeline. I'm going to scrub my to the timeline to frame 96, and I'll select my offset property and adjust its value, and then once again right click on offset, key selected. Now if I scrub in my timeline, you'll see that the object is animated. I can also play the animation. We'll now take a look at the squash nonlinear deformer, and I'm going to select my deformer here, delete it, just so that we have the regular cylinder to demonstrate this squash deformer. So my cylinder selected, I'll go to Deform, Nonlinear, Squash, and you'll see that we have this property factor, and if I adjust it, I get this nice squash and stretch effect. Squash and stretch is one of the 12 principles of animation. And what's important with squash and stretch is that a object or form maintains the same volume, so that if it squashes on this axis, it has to stretch out on that axis. Or going in the opposite direction, it should compress in here as it gets stretched out this way. So this is the squash deformer. The squash deformer is definitely a useful deformer that might be used more for animation, but you might also find some uses for it when modeling as well. I'm going to go ahead and delete my deformer, and we're going to take a look at what I think is a very fun nonlinear deformer, the twist deformer. So I'll select my mesh, deform, nonlinear, twist. I'm going to adjust the start angle property here, and notice that when I adjust it, the form twists. Remember that you can move the deformer off of the mesh itself. Let's see what happens when I do that. And the final deformer we'll look at is the wave deformer. I'm going to delete this deformer, and the wave deformer, probably the cylinder is not the best one to illustrate this with, so I'll delete the cylinder as well. And what I'm going to do is create a polygon plane. I'll just increase the size of it, and we'll keep the resolution as it is for now because I want to show you something with that. So I have my polygon plane selected, and I'll go to Deform, Nonlinear, Wave. Like some of the other deformers we looked at, this one also has an amplitude property, which we can increase. And it also has a wavelength property, which we can also increase or decrease, depending on the effect that we want. Now the reason why I left the geometry as I did is because, again, I want to re-emphasize that you have to have enough geometry in your mesh for it to really work properly. You can see what my deformer looks like here. Maybe I'll bring the wavelength, make it a few less waves here. I'm going to select my geometry, and while I don't normally recommend doing this, going back in history here, I'm going to go to the inputs, polygon plane, and I'm going to increase my subdivision's width and height. And you'll see that that gives us a much better result with this deformer because we now have more geometry to work with. Remember that all these different properties, if they can change over time, they can be animated. So I'm going to go to frame 1. I'm going to select offset here in the channel box, right mouse click and key it, and I'm going to drag my timeline all the way to the end to frame 120, and I will adjust my offset here. and I will set yet another key on that as well. Rewind and play. So those are the nonlinear deformers. They're useful for both modeling as well as animating. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.